My name is Peyton, and I grew up in a small house that always smelled of fresh bread, where every morning began with the steady tapping of a wooden spatula on the counter, and the warm air was saturated with the aromas of cinnamon, vanilla, and yeast dough. Dad inherited the family bakery from his parents, and I loved spending time with him after school, watching him knead dough with ease, his strong hands covered in flour, and a soft, tired smile on his lips. It seemed to me that there was something fascinating in these movements, some kind of magic that turned simple ingredients into crispy baguettes, airy buns, pies with berry filling that melted in my mouth. Dad loved his job, loved the smell of fresh pastries, loved the process itself, which had so much care, patience, and warmth. But Mom was completely different. She never shared his hobbies, never went into the bakery for more than a couple of minutes to say something or take money from the cash register. She worked as a realtor, always with impeccable styling, in expensive suits and high heels that tapped a jerky, impatient rhythm on the wooden floor. She brought much more money into the house than Dad did, and she never missed an opportunity to remind him of this, as if financial superiority gave her the right to despise his choices, his life, his passion. I got used to their quarrels. I got used to the fact that evenings at our house were often filled with tense voices, screams cut through the silence, and Dad always tried to calm Mom, who said with a venomous grin that he would never achieve anything, that his bakery was just a waste of time. I was 12 that night when my mom called me. I was clumsy, awkward, with an eternal book in my hands, and preferred the world of pages to all these adult showdowns that made me uneasy. I was setting out the plates when I heard another collision begin. Mom's voice was cold and full of contempt. Another slow month, John. When will you finally collect your thoughts? I froze, clutching the spoon in my hands. Dad's response was quiet, almost pleading. Sarah, please, not in front of Peyton. Oh, who cares? My mom snapped with annoyance. She needs to know what a loser her father is. I gripped the edge of the table, forcing myself not to cry. It was a routine, familiar scene, played out over and over again, but it didn't make it any easier. I loved Dad, but it hurt me to see how he let Mom treat him like he was nobody. I was scared that there was nothing I could do to stop it. Where's my wine? My mom barked, and I jumped up, rushing to the refrigerator, pulling out the bottle with trembling hands. When I put the glass in front of her, some spilled onto the tablecloth, and I barely had time to recoil when Mom glared at me with a glittering glare. You're a useless girl, you can't even do this right. Dad raised his head from the table. Sarah, it's just a little wine, it's okay. You're too soft on her, Mom replied coldly, taking a sip. No wonder she'll grow up as pathetic as you. I wanted to scream, I wanted to throw something at the wall, but instead I gritted my teeth and ran into my room, slamming the door behind me and burying my face in the pillow. I didn't understand why Dad put up with it, why he let her say such things. I was afraid to become a part of this war, because I knew, I don't have a chance. All I could do was hide, try to be as quiet and inconspicuous as possible, disappear into the shadows, so as not to give my mother a reason to vent her irritation on me. But the next morning, the house was strangely quiet. There was no usual bakery noise, no baking aroma, and there was no sharp tapping of my mother's heels on the floor. I went downstairs and saw Dad at the kitchen table. He was sitting motionless, staring at one point. His face was pale, and there was a piece of paper in front of him. I asked, but I already knew the answer. Dad silently handed me a note, and I felt the blood drain from my face as my eyes ran over the lines written in his familiar, neat handwriting. John, I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving with Richard. He can give me the life I deserve, not all this urban nonsense. Peyton, don't try to find me, you're a dead weight to me. John, you're a loser, and you've made our daughter as worthless as you are. Goodbye. I stared at the paper, feeling something snap inside me, as if I'd been punched in the stomach. Mom's gone. She just walked away, leaving Dad and me in this empty, discolored house, throwing a parting poison, as if wanting to make us even more painful. The next few months after Mom left merged into one long, gray blur filled with court proceedings, endless conversations between adults who, as it seemed to me at the time, discussed my life with Dad as if it were some kind of financial transaction or another bureaucratic procedure, and not the fate of living people who had experienced betrayal and abandonment. My father filed for divorce and demanded to deprive my mother of parental rights, because she did not just leave him, she also abandoned me, her only daughter, leaving me without a single word of regret, without the slightest hint that she had ever felt love for me. I remember sitting in the huge, cold courthouse, feeling a shiver run through my body from fear and excitement, as my fingers clenched into a fist, looking for support in the warmth of my father's hand, and despite his own excitement, he held me tightly, as if with this simple gesture he could protect me from everything. The world. We waited a long time for my mother to appear, but she never came. Her place at the table remained empty, just as her promises to me were empty. I remember disconnecting from reality while the adults were talking, as if their voices had turned into a distant, monotonous hum, where only occasionally I caught individual words that sounded frightening and irrevocable: refusal, insolvent parent, legal responsibility. When it was over, when the judge signed the papers, Dad squeezed my hand even tighter and, leaning over to me, said softly, "It's over, Katie. The divorce is final, and your mother no longer has any rights over you. Now it's just you and me." I nodded, but I couldn't tell if I was relieved, bitter, or devastated. Life got harder after that. Dad threw himself into work to forget himself, spending more time in the bakery than ever. Even though I was only a 12-year-old girl, I had to take on most of the housework. I came home from school, sat down for lessons, then started cooking, washing, cleaning. All this became my new reality, in which there was no place for childhood, carelessness, and lightness. So the days, weeks, and months passed, and looking back, I realized that 3 years had passed in this endless cycle, as if time had condensed into one long, repetitive instant. But right after my 15th birthday, everything changed again. Dad came home late, his face was tense, and there was something between shock and deep sorrow in his eyes. He silently sat down on a kitchen chair, and when I anxiously asked what had happened, he exhaled one short but heavy word: "Uncle Pete died." I knew that Dad was close to him. Uncle Pete was his cousin, the last relative he still kept in touch with. "Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry," I said, hugging him tightly, and even though he hugged me back, he quickly pulled away, as if he still didn't fully realize what had happened. "Katie, you won't believe this." He shook his head, his eyes suddenly widened, as if he was trying to make sense of the words he had just said. "He left me everything. Almost $300,000. I am his only living relative." I didn't know what to say. For us, who were used to counting every penny, it was not just a large sum, it was a fortune, a chance to change our lives, an opportunity to breathe freely. Dad quickly figured out what to do. He invested part of the money in the bakery, he upgraded the equipment, expanded the menu, updated the interior, and in just a few months our small bakery turned into a real urban hit, a place that was talked about and where people came not just for bread, but for the comfort, atmosphere, and special taste that reminded them of home. He hired more staff, increased opening hours, and before we realized it, we had a second location in the city. By the time I turned 16, Dad already had 3 thriving bakeries, and our financial problems were a thing of the past. I was able to quit my job after school and focus on my studies. We even went on our first real vacation in many years, 2 trips to Europe, filled with emotions, laughter, vivid photos, and the feeling that we can finally afford to be happy. As the years passed, my mother became something distant to me, almost a ghostly memory that no longer had any power over me. Dad dated someone sometimes, but he never wanted to remarry, and I didn't rush him. We were fine as it was. The high school graduation flew by in a blur of throwing caps, tearful hugs, and laughter mixed with parting words. I worked tirelessly, and it paid off. I was accepted to the state university, where I was going to study finance. On the morning of my departure for the university, Dad handed me a small box. I asked, opening it and finding a key inside. Dad smiled, "Your graduation present. This is an apartment near the campus. Now you don't have to worry about dorm life or rent." I stared at him, not knowing what to say. "Dad, I cannot. It's too much." He brushed off my protests with his usual gentle confidence. "You deserve it, Katie. Now go make me proud of you." College flew by in a rush of lectures, exams, and late-night study sessions. I tried to make the most of the opportunities my father gave me, and when I wasn't studying, I did internships in financial companies. By the time I graduated from university, I already had a job as a junior financial analyst. On the first day, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, straightening my jacket and looking at my reflection. "You're going to make it, Peyton," I said softly to myself, took a deep breath, and, summoning all my resolve, set off towards adulthood. By the time I turned 32, it had been many years since I first set foot in my university, determined to succeed, and all that time I had been working tirelessly, building my life brick by brick, carefully following the plan that I thought was supposed to be to protect me from any surprises. The investments I had invested in since the first days of my job had borne fruit. Now I had 2 apartments for rent, generating a stable income, in addition to the one I lived in myself, and this gave me a sense of confidence and security, allowing me not to worry about the future as much as I had to worry about childhood. Life was good, and I could finally say that I was happy with what I had achieved, but then the phone rang, which changed everything. "Katie," Dad's voice was strained, and it instantly made me wary. "Can you come? I need to talk to you about something." I felt something heavy sink into my stomach, a premonition of something bad, but I tried to push it away. Half an hour later, I was at my parents' house, where my father met me, sitting at the kitchen table, and when I saw his face, my heart sank. He looked older than ever, as if his years had become heavier in the last few weeks, outlined in wrinkles, shadows under his eyes, and haggard features. I sat down across from him, trying not to show how worried I was. He took a deep breath, looking at me with mild sadness. "It's cancer, honey. The 4th stage. The pancreas." The world tilted, as if someone had shifted it off its axis, and everything around it blurred, became indistinct. "No," I whispered, feeling an icy shiver run through my body. There must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. The following year became the most difficult ordeal of my life. It turned into an endless series of treatments, remissions, relapses, hopes that gave way to disappointment, and I spent every free minute in the hospital or at his house, cooking his favorite cheese soup, even when he could no longer eat, when he was sick even from the smell. I clung to every good day, to his every smile, to every moment when he looked almost the same as I remembered him, strong, cheerful, with the smell of flour and sugar firmly ingrained in his clothes. One day, on a cool autumn day, I arrived at his house and saw him sitting in his favorite armchair, looking out the window with an expression as if he was trying to memorize every detail of the view behind the glass. He turned to me, patting the spot next to him. "We need to talk, Katie." His voice was flat, but there was an air of inevitability about it. I sat down, clenching my fingers, and he sighed. "The doctors gave me a maximum of 6 months." I shook my head sharply. "No. They're wrong. We will get a second opinion. We'll try another course of treatment, we'll—" "Katie," he gently interrupted me, taking my hand in his. "It's okay. I've come to terms with it." Tears welled up in my throat, but I pressed my lips together, trying to hold back. "I sell bakeries," he continued, letting go of my hand and looking out the window again. "You'll get everything. You will be provided for life." I pulled back, wiping my eyes. "I don't need your money, Dad. I need you." He smiled, sadly but warmly. I know, honey. But that's how I can take care of you, even when I'm gone. The next 7 months were precious and painful. We talked more than ever before about everything and nothing. I tried to memorize every line on his face, every shade of his voice, the sound of his laughter, the smell of flour, which seemed to still remain with him, despite the fact that he had not been to the bakery for a long time. And then, on a quiet Wednesday morning, he was gone. The funeral was a blur, as if I was watching from the sidelines, not quite realizing that this was happening to me. And then I was left alone in his empty house, clutching his beloved apron, still smelling of vanilla. The lawyer soon handed me the documents. True to his word, Dad left me everything. I used the money from the sale of the bakery to buy 2 more apartments because it felt right, because I wanted to keep building something solid like he was doing. A year has passed, and I've started to find my balance. My job kept me busy, real estate management gave me a sense of purpose, life gradually settled into its rut, and I finally began to feel at ease. And then there was another call that turned everything upside down. Peyton, the female voice on the other end of the line, was painfully familiar, but so far away that for a moment I thought I was imagining things. It's your mom. The silence hung between us, tense, oppressive, stretching to infinity. I'm back in town, she continued when I couldn't answer. I'd like to see you, if you don't mind. My mind was racing, torn between fear and anger, between the desire to immediately hang up on me, protecting myself from this woman who had so easily abandoned me, and that painful, stubborn curiosity that still lived in me, the part that clung to memories of how, in my distant childhood, I dreamed that Mom would come back one day, take my hand, tell me that it was all a mistake. Okay, I heard myself say. Let's meet at Rosie's Cafe tomorrow at noon. The next day, I arrived at the cafe earlier than the scheduled time, and while I was sitting at a table by the window, looking out at the street, trying to cope with the growing excitement, I felt a tight knot in my stomach. Meeting my mother, the same woman who left so many years ago, leaving behind only bitter words in a farewell letter, was supposed to be something of a final chord, but I couldn't decide whether it would be forgiveness or a final breakup. When the clock struck noon, the cafe door opened and I saw her. She looked older, but still elegant. Her well-groomed blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her lips were wearing the usual muted lipstick, and her posture gave her away as a woman accustomed to behaving with dignity, but her eyes. His gaze betrayed uncertainty, tension, almost timidity. However, she wasn't the only one who caught my attention. Behind Mom was a young teenage girl of about 17, with long dark hair, wearing skinny jeans and a hoodie with someone else's name on the back. Mom noticed me and hurried over to me, smiling as if we hadn't had those years of pain and silence, as if we'd met after a long separation that both were trying to shorten. Peyton, honey, you look wonderful, she said, sitting down across from him. And this is Lily. Your sister. I felt something inside me snap. Sister. The word hit me like an unexpected cold rain, depriving me of air. I looked at the girl, who awkwardly lowered her gaze, as if she knew in advance that her presence would be a shock to me. We sat down, and Mom started telling a story that was supposed to explain everything. About how Richard, the man she once left with, abandoned her shortly after Lily was born, how they fought for survival, how she had to work tirelessly, and how she finally decided to return to her hometown to start all over again. I listened, but there was no remorse in those words, no real regret, just a statement of facts, an attempt to justify myself, mitigate the consequences of my own decisions. I heard you have a rental property, she said, her voice suddenly lighter, almost casual. I noticed that she was silent for a moment, as if she was wondering how best to formulate her next question, but her meaning was clear. I looked at Lily, who was still examining her hands, trying not to meet my eyes, clearly feeling uncomfortable. And I thought about Dad, about how he always taught me to be kind, even when it's hard, even when it seems like a person doesn't deserve it. I thought about that little girl I used to be, who so desperately wanted her mom back. Okay, I heard myself say, and the words seemed to come out of my mouth. I have an apartment that has just been vacated. You can stay there. Mom's face lit up, and her lips stretched into a satisfied smile. That's great, thank you, of course we'll pay the rent. I raised my hand, cutting off any further attempts to discuss it. No rent. Utilities only. Mom nodded in agreement, clearly pleased with this outcome, and I continued to watch Lily. She looked too young, too lost, too familiar. I remembered how I was at her age, lonely, scared, looking for someone to hold my hand and tell me that everything would be fine. Are you in the 10th grade? I asked, trying to diffuse the tension. Lily finally looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw the same timidity that once lived in me. Yes, she replied, nodding. It must be strange to start studying at a new school in the senior year. She shrugged her shoulders. A little bit. I felt a pang of sympathy. If you need help with anything at school, or just to talk, I'm here, okay? Lily smiled slightly, for the first time in the entire meeting, and said softly, Thank you. It means a lot. When we left the cafe, Mom hugged me again, lightly, almost deliberately, but I felt her squeeze me a little tighter than the situation required. You're an angel, Peyton, she said, pulling away. I know that I have a lot to fix, but I hope that we can start all over again. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, afraid that my voice would betray too much emotion. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was going to get a lot more complicated, that the balance I'd worked so hard to build was now under threat. But, for better or for worse, Mom came back into my life, and with her, I got a sister. Only time could show what it would mean for all of us. The months after their return were strange, filled with restraint and caution. Mom quickly found a job as a realtor, as if she had never left, as if the years of absence could simply be erased, as if they had never existed. Lily enrolled in a local school, preparing for her final exams. I kept my distance, not knowing how to deal with this new reality, this alien feeling that I had a family that was close, but at the same time seemed so far away. From time to time, my mother called me, came to visit, and it always sounded the same. Peyton, dear, thanks again for the apartment. You are a real blessing. I nodded, feeling awkward next to her, not knowing how to respond to her enthusiastic gratitude. It's okay, Mom. I'm glad I could help. Lily and I have developed a cautious but warm friendship. I helped her with her math homework, listened to her talk about college plans, and in a way, I was pleased to have a sister. But there was always an invisible barrier between us, the weight of the missed years, which it was impossible to just get rid of, no matter how kind and sincere I tried to be. Then came Lily's graduation. I was sitting at the end of the hall, watching her walk across the stage in a black robe, take her diploma from the director's hands and freeze for a moment, smiling confusedly, as if not fully believing that this stage of her life had really ended. I caught her eye, and Lily gave me a barely perceptible nod, as if it was our unspoken agreement, a sign that, despite all the difficulties, she knew I was here. Mom was sitting in the front row, beaming with pride, and at that moment I caught myself thinking an absurd thought. What if she had never left? What would our life be like if we were really a family, without these gaps, losses, betrayals? But this thought was too far from reality to cling to it. The next day, my mom showed up on my doorstep without warning, and from the very first second I realized that something was wrong. Her face was flushed and her eyes sparkled with anger. There was tension in her posture, and before I could say anything, she was already pushing her way into the apartment, pushing me away with a light but insistent movement. We need to talk, she barked, heading for the living room. I followed her, still not understanding what was going on, and was about to ask what was the matter, but Mom abruptly turned to me, and her gaze was full of icy, restrained irritation. Don't play dumb, Peyton, she said through gritted teeth. I know everything. I know about the apartments. All 4 of them. My heart sank. What are you talking about? I tried to keep my voice steady, but the tension building inside me was too palpable. About what you're hiding from us, Mom screamed, clenching her fists. You're living a social life while Lily and I are somehow managing. I felt anger rising in me. I'm sorry, I crossed my arms over my chest, taking a step back, but as far as I remember, you live in one of those apartments. Is that not enough? Mom snorted contemptuously. Half of this property should be mine. She spat out, glaring at me. I'm your mother. I couldn't help but laugh, but there was no humor in that laugh. You can't be serious, I breathed, shaking my head. You lost the right to my property the day you left us. Remember? No parental rights, no alimony. Mom changed tactics, and her face suddenly became softer, and her voice became pleading. Peyton, honey, think about Lily, she said, coming closer. She needs money for college. If you just sold one apartment. No way, I pulled away, looking her straight in the eye. Lily's education is not my responsibility. How can you be so selfish? Mom howled, throwing up her hands. After all I've done for you. That was the last straw. Everything you've done for me? I repeated her words in disbelief. You mean like you left me? Did you call me useless in your farewell note? Or are you talking about how you lived in my apartment for months without paying a cent? Mom recoiled as if I'd hit her. Her lips were trembling, but not a single word escaped them. She just stood looking at me, opening and closing her mouth like a fish pulled ashore. And then, without saying another word, she turned around and ran out, slamming the door loudly. I remained standing in the living room, clenching my fists, trembling with anger and pain. How dare she? How dare he come to me with claims? How dare he try to accuse me? I collapsed onto the couch, resting my head in my hands. Deep down, I knew it was risky to let my mom back into my life, but I hoped. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but it certainly wasn't that. When the adrenaline began to subside, a deep, aching sadness came. This woman, who was supposed to be my protector, my rock, turned out to be just a stranger who was trying to use me. But what about Lily now? It's been 2 weeks since Mom's scandal. I tried to live as if nothing had happened, but the disturbing worry was still in me. One morning, I was sitting in my favorite cafe, enjoying the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, when I noticed that the barista was looking at me strangely, with something like sympathy or maybe even hidden condemnation. While I was waiting for my order, I heard snatches of conversation at the next table. Can you believe that? One of the women said, her voice filled with indignation. To charge your own mother when she has so many apartments. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. They couldn't talk about me. But they were talking. Over the next few days, I noticed more and more glances at me, curious, judgmental, wary. In the shops, on the street, in the office, people were whispering to each other, and as soon as I came into view, the conversations immediately stopped, and then resumed behind my back. It took me a while to figure out what was going on, but it soon became obvious that Mom was busy spreading her twisted version of events to anyone who was willing to listen. And then there was a Facebook post. I saw him during my lunch break and almost choked on my sandwich. In black and white, with a photo of Lily and me standing together at her graduation, beaming, Mom wrote. My daughter, Peyton, has 4 apartments that she rents out, earning a fortune, but refuses to help pay for her sister's college tuition. Moreover, she makes me pay for the apartment I live in when I'm barely making ends meet. I am heartbroken knowing that my own child can be so greedy and selfish. Every comment under this post was like a knife in the heart. How could she do this to her mother? What a terrible person, she only thinks about money. I always knew that something was wrong with Peyton. Poor Lily, I hope she didn't grow up to be so heartless. Dozens of comments, hundreds of likes, reposts, discussions. People I hadn't seen in years, old classmates, acquaintances, even distant relatives, eagerly picked up on this story, reproaching me for my cruelty, for my indifference, for the fact that, in their opinion, I turned away from my family in favor of money. And none of them remembered, or wanted to remember, that this woman had once abandoned me when I was a child. When it seemed to me that things couldn't get any worse, my boss called me into his office. "Peyton," he said, folding his hands on the table. "We need to discuss this situation with your mother. This is starting to affect the company's reputation." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Sir, I can explain." He raised his hand, interrupting me. "I'm not asking for details, but I need you to resolve this issue quietly and quickly. We cannot allow such a drama to unfold around our company. Don't get me wrong." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. When I returned to my desk, a new notification was already waiting for me at work, a message about unpaid utility bills for my mother's apartment. Great. Just fine. With trembling hands, I dialed my mother's number. She answered almost immediately, and instead of greeting, an irritated voice came on the line. I took a deep breath, trying to speak evenly. "Mom, you have unpaid utility bills. We agreed that you would pay for them. Remember?" She grinned. "Oh, please. You're awash in money from all these apartments. You can easily afford to pay a few bills." "That's not the point," I gritted my teeth, feeling anger simmer. "We had an agreement." "An agreement?" She interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What kind of agreement are you talking about?" "About where you, my daughter, should help your family. It's a great agreement, and it's brought us a lot of benefits." I sat with my phone in my hand, feeling the world crumble around me. How could I let everything go so far? I tried to do the right thing. I tried to be kind, to give Mom a chance, to give Lily a place to call home, and in the end I ended up being guilty of everything. It was with a heavy heart that I made an appointment with a lawyer. Miss Stevens, an elderly woman with penetrating eyes, studied the papers briefly, then put them aside and folded her hands on the table. "Miss Thompson, you have every right to evict your mother," she said calmly. "She does not have a lease agreement, she does not pay for housing, and you have already given her advance notice of the arrears." I nodded, feeling both relieved and horrified. "What do I need to do?" She pulled an official document out of the folder and handed it to me. "This is an eviction notice. You need to give it to her. If she doesn't comply, we'll file a lawsuit." Armed with the documents, I headed to my mom's apartment, which, despite everything that had happened, still legally belonged to me. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter than they should have, and I tried to breathe more evenly, but everything inside was raging: anger, fatigue, disappointment. It seemed like every move was difficult, but I knew I couldn't back down. When I knocked on the door, my hands were shaking slightly, but as soon as it opened and my mother appeared on the threshold, the trembling was replaced by cold determination. "Oh, it's you," she drawled, crossing her arms over her chest. Her face was contorted with displeasure, but there was something like complacency in her eyes, as if she already knew why I had come and was ready for another performance. "Have you finally thought about selling the apartment to pay for Lily's college? The school payment is next month, you should hurry up." I blinked in disbelief. "Are you serious?" Anger burst out, and my heart started pounding faster. "After everything you've done, are you still making demands on me?" Mom just grinned, shrugging her shoulders. "Don't be so dramatic, Peyton. It's the least you can do for the family." That was the last straw. I shoved the eviction notice into her hands. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." She stared at the paper, and I saw her face gradually turn pale, as confusion gave way to realization, and then a flash of rage. "You ungrateful little bitch. Stop it," she screamed, crumpling the paper in her fist. Her voice echoed through the apartment, making the walls shake. "After all I've done for you." I stood my ground, not moving, even when everything inside was clenched with pain. "Everything you've done?" I repeated slowly, each word throbbing in my temples. "You mean like you left me? How did she spread lies about me?" Mom lunged forward, and her hand rose. I reflexively jerked back, but there was no blow. Instead, she grabbed my shirt, digging her nails into the fabric. Her face was too close, and I could feel her breathing, hot, ragged, filled with hatred. "You're nothing, do you hear?" she hissed, her eyes glittering with anger. "You're selfish, heartless." I managed to pull away, and I felt my phone in my pocket. "That's enough." My voice sounded steady, even though I was trembling inside. "I'm calling the police." Mom's eyes widened, but she didn't back down. "Oh, come on, Peyton, call me," she sneered mockingly, crossing her arms. "Let's see who of us will look worse." When the police arrived, I could no longer hold back my tears. I showed the officers my documents, explained the situation as calmly as I could, but my voice still broke. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, addressing his mother, "I suggest you calm down and discuss this issue in a civilized manner." "Discuss it?" Mom chuckled, glaring at me. "She's trying to throw us out on the street." The second officer turned to me, his face professionally unreadable. "Miss Thompson, this is legally a civil case. We cannot forcibly evict her without a court order. You'd better try to resolve this amicably or go to court." I nodded, feeling drained. When the police left, Mom grinned again. "You won't do that," she said mockingly. "You don't have the courage to sue your own mother." I looked at her, and at that moment, something inside me finally broke. It was the woman who gave birth to me, but was never a mother. "Look at me," I said softly, but there was no doubt or hesitation in my voice. And before she could answer, I turned around and left. When I got to my car, the apartment door slammed from behind, but I didn't even turn around. The trip home was a blur. I thought about what lay ahead, the court hearings, more drama, more pain, but perhaps also a chance to finally free myself from the toxic grip that my mother had been holding me with all these years. The day of the trial came, and I felt my stomach clench with tension when I entered the courtroom. Mom was sitting across from him, clutching a handkerchief in her hands. Her eyes were red and swollen, and I couldn't tell if they were real tears or part of a carefully staged performance. Lily was sitting next to her, and I felt my heart sink at the sight of her confused, depressed face. She looked like she wanted to disappear. I took a deep breath and took my seat. It's time to break this vicious circle. The trial began, and Mom staged a real performance, turning the courtroom into a theater stage, where she, of course, was the main character in a tragic play. Her eyes, surrounded by dark circles, were full of tears, her lips trembled, and her voice broke and broke as she, like a victim, addressed the judge, trying to evoke sympathy from everyone present. "Your Honor," she sighed, pausing to effectively wipe a tear from the corner of her eye, "my own daughter, my flesh and blood, is trying to throw me and my youngest daughter, her sister, onto the street. She's become so heartless, so cruel, that she doesn't even think about what we're going to do, where we're going to live." She covered her face with her hands, and the hall was filled with stifled sighs. Someone's whispers ran through the rows. "After all I've done for her," she continued, sobbing, "after all the love and care I've given her." I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm, feeling the blood pounding in my temples. It was so ridiculous, so deceitful, so hideously false that I wanted to scream, to break this hypocritical silence, but I knew it wasn't my time to speak. My lawyer stood up, his voice steady and confident, without a shadow of doubt. "Your Honor," He began, "I would like to present some evidence that paints a completely different picture of this situation." He paused, giving the judge time to prepare, then began methodically, coldly, and clearly stating the facts. First of all, Mrs. Stevens abandoned her daughter when she was 12 years old. Later, the court officially stripped her of her parental rights, and she also never paid alimony. He laid out in front of the judge the documents confirming his words, a copy of the decree on the deprivation of parental rights, financial reports, evidence of past court proceedings. Secondly, he continued, the plaintiff provided her mother with housing without charging rent, agreeing only that utility bills would be paid on time. However, data from bank transfers and utility reports show that Mrs. Stevens has not paid a single bill for the entire period of her stay. I glanced at my mom and saw her face starting to lose color, but my lawyer wasn't done yet. Thirdly, his voice became tougher. We have evidence that Mrs. Stevens is not in fact in a difficult financial situation, as she claims. Mom's head snapped up, her eyes widened like a man who had just been caught red-handed. Currently, my lawyer continued, she is the owner of real estate in another city, an apartment left to her by a former partner. Moreover, we have extracts from the rental register, which confirm that she rents out this property and receives a stable monthly income. There was a tense silence in the hall. The judge turned slowly to my mother, his expression stern, his eyes cold, devoid of the amount of sympathy she might have hoped for. "Is that true, Mrs. Stevens?" "What is it?" he asked, and there was no tolerance in his voice. Mom opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish stranded on a beach, before finally whispering, "Yes, Your Honor." My fingers dug into the arms of the chair, and my heart skipped a beat. The judge's voice was icy as he delivered his verdict. This court satisfies the eviction requirement. In addition, Mrs. Stevens is obligated to pay the rent for the entire period during which she occupied the apartment for free. Your actions, Mrs. Stevens, are simply shameless. The case is closed. The hammer came down with a loud thud that echoed throughout my body. It was all over. We won. When we left the courtroom, I noticed Lily. She was standing a little way away. Her face was pale and her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked lost, confused, and my heart sank painfully. It wasn't her fault. I walked over to her, ignoring the prickly gaze of my mom, who was obviously hoping that I would just walk by. "Lily," I said softly, feeling my anger and pain recede before a deeper feeling, sympathy. "I'm sorry it came to this. If you need help, real help, you can still come to me." She swallowed, tears filling her eyes. "I'm sorry, Peyton." Her voice was shaking. "I didn't know." I smiled sadly, squeezing her hand lightly, and then turned around and left, feeling like a weight was finally lifted from my shoulders. In the following weeks, Mom and Lily moved out of my apartment. I've heard rumors that they've moved to another mom's apartment, the one she forgot to mention in court. I didn't try to contact them, and they didn't get in touch either. One evening, I was standing in the empty apartment where my mother had recently lived, and I looked at the bare walls, empty cupboards, and traces of their presence, which were already beginning to fade. The memories flashed back one after another, the hope I felt when my mom first came back into my life, the pain of her betrayal, the stress of the trial. But now, in this silence, I realized that, despite all the severity of the experience, there was something new inside me. Freedom. I left the apartment, closed the door behind me, and after taking a deep breath, I felt something light, like relief, like hope, being born inside me. For the first time in a long time, my life belonged to me again.